The smell of burning flesh clung to the iron bars. His body was strapped flat to the gridiron, seared on one side and still twitching. He told his executioners, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." It was August 10th, 258 AD. In the city of Rome, under the orders of Emperor Valerian, Lawrence the deacon was executed. The method was precise and deliberate. He was tied to a metal grate placed over hot coals. According to Christian tradition, the punishment was meant to degrade and terrorize. He did not cry out. He responded with a sentence that would be repeated for centuries. The man being killed was Lawrence of Rome, a senior deacon in the early Christian church and one of the 7 deacons under Pope Sixtus II. Just days earlier, Sixtus and several clergy had been executed as part of Valerian's persecution of Christians. Lawrence had been ordered to turn over the church's wealth. Instead, he gathered the poor and sick and said, "Here are the treasures of the church." For that, he was made an example. He didn't begin as a martyr, just a servant hand, a witness to power. Lawrence was born on December 31st, 225 AD, in Hispania, likely in the town of Huesca, in present-day Spain. At the time, Hispania was a well-integrated Roman province, and his family belonged to the Christian minority that remained largely underground due to periodic persecutions. Almost nothing is known about his parents, but it is believed they were Christian and gave him an early religious education. As a young man, Lawrence traveled to Zaragoza, a regional center for Roman administration and trade. There, he met Sixtus, a scholar and teacher who would later become Pope Sixtus II. Their relationship marked the first major turning point in Lawrence's life. Under Sixtus's guidance, he was trained in theology, scripture, and pastoral care. When Sixtus was elected Bishop of Rome in 257 AD, he brought Lawrence with him to the capital. Within a short time, Lawrence was appointed as one of the 7 deacons of Roman official position of considerable responsibility. He was the archdeacon, which placed him in charge of church finances and the distribution of alms. At just over 30 years old, he managed the treasury, coordinated relief efforts for the poor, and had close access to the Pope. The office of deacon carried both spiritual and administrative weight. Lawrence was seen regularly in the poorer districts of Rome, offering aid to the sick, the widowed, and orphans. He was well known among both the clergy and the city's most vulnerable citizens. Though young, he was trusted to make decisions involving both property and doctrine at a time when the church operated in a legal gray zone neither fully recognized nor fully suppressed. This early success was not the product of birth or wealth, but of loyalty, discipline, and visibility in service. His position placed him close to the center of religious authority, but also exposed him to Roman scrutiny at the highest level. But this early promise would later give way to violence and control. Lawrence's early formation as a Christian took place in a time of sporadic but intensifying persecution. Christianity was not illegal across the empire by default, but public practice was often punished depending on the emperor in power. In Hispania, the church operated quietly. Its teachings passed through close-knit communities. From an early age, Lawrence would have been taught scripture by oral instruction and private texts, many of which were copied by hand and circulated secretly. His most important influence came from Sixtus, a Roman theologian and teacher who had lived through earlier crackdowns on Christian activity. Sixtus emphasized doctrinal purity, the authority of the bishopric, and the obligation to care for the poor. Lawrence became his student in Zaragoza, where he was introduced to early Christian texts, the writings of church fathers, and interpretations of Roman law from a Christian ethical standpoint. The Roman Empire valued structure, hierarchy, and public order. Christianity, by contrast, taught loyalty to a divine kingdom that transcended the empire's authority. This tension shaped Lawrence's thinking. His position as a deacon would later require him to obey 2 systems simultaneously: Roman civic expectations and Christian moral doctrine. The two would not remain compatible for long. As Lawrence rose through the church hierarchy, He adopted the practice of distributing alms directly to the poor, often selling church goods to fund this work. This was not simply charity, it was theological in nature. For early Christians, caring for the poor was not optional. It was considered a direct form of service to God. Lawrence's beliefs were reinforced by daily contact with the sick and outcast, whom Roman elites typically avoided or punished. Lawrence also absorbed a key ideological view that the true wealth of the church was not gold or property, but the people themselves, especially the vulnerable. This conviction would later define his fatal choice. Rome, meanwhile, viewed the church's growing influence with suspicion. Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor, did not participate in state cults, and gathered independently. By the time Valerian came to power, the state had already begun monitoring church leaders. In Lawrence, faith and function were tightly bound. He saw no line between obedience to the church and confrontation with Roman power. He had been trained not for rebellion, but for quiet resistance, rooted in the belief that service to the poor was service to Christ, regardless of consequence. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test not in theory, but in power. When Pope Sixtus II was elected in 257 AD, Lawrence was brought to Rome and appointed archdeacon, the highest-ranking deacon in the church. This role gave him oversight of all church property and charitable distribution in the capital. It also made him a key public figure in the Christian community, visible, trusted, and closely tied to papal authority. Rome was the empire's heart, and the church was expanding rapidly within it. Though Christianity was not officially banned, it remained legally precarious. Valerian, who became emperor in 253 AD, initially tolerated Christians, but by 257, his policy shifted. Under pressure from military defeats and political instability, he issued edicts targeting the clergy. The goal was clear: eliminate Christian leadership to prevent organized resistance. In 258 AD, the crackdown began. Pope Sixtus II and 4 deacons were arrested during a religious service in a Roman cemetery and executed immediately. Lawrence, not present at the time, became the highest-ranking church official still alive in the city. This elevated his importance and his risk. Roman authorities ordered him to turn over the church's treasures. As archdeacon, Lawrence had access to gold, vessels, and property deeds. He asked for 3 days to gather everything. During that time, Lawrence acted with intention. He distributed much of the church's wealth to the poor and sick, including widows, orphans, and lepers. Then, instead of fleeing or hiding, he returned to the Roman prefect and presented a group of impoverished citizens. "These are the treasures of the church," he said. The response was immediate. Lawrence was arrested. His actions were not just defiant, they were symbolic. In the Roman system, wealth was power, and mocking that value was an open challenge. By placing the poor above Roman demands, Lawrence transformed Christian charity into political resistance. He was sentenced to death. Unlike Sixtus, he was not executed by sword. According to Christian tradition, he was tied to a gridiron and roasted alive. The choice of method reflected both punishment and performance. A slow death meant to display imperial power and make an example of what happened to those who mocked Rome's authority. Now in power, Lawrence began turning belief into law and law into control. The death of Pope Sixtus II created an immediate crisis for the church in Rome. He had been the spiritual leader, and with 4 deacons killed alongside him, the structure of Christian leadership in the city was broken. Only a few high-ranking clergy remained, and none held more authority or visibility than Lawrence. Lawrence did not attempt to consolidate power. Instead, he treated his position as one of stewardship. He moved quickly to distribute the remaining church resources to the poor. This was not a political coup, but a direct interpretation of his responsibility as archdeacon. However, Roman authorities interpreted it differently. Valerian's policy was clear: destroy the church's leadership and seize its wealth. The Edict of 257 had targeted bishops and priests. A second edict in 258 expanded to Christian senators, knights, and even women. Property would be confiscated, executions would be public. The goal was to fracture the church from the top down. When Lawrence presented Rome's poor as the treasure of the church, he crossed a line. He had not only disobeyed the order to surrender wealth, had redefined the very idea of wealth in a public confrontation with Roman officials. He was imprisoned immediately. His punishment was not standard. While many high-ranking Christians were simply beheaded, Lawrence was subjected to prolonged execution. According to tradition, he was stripped, bound, and laid over a gridiron with burning coals beneath. The process was slow and theatrical. No official Roman records describe this method. Some historians suggest that the story of roasting may have developed later, based on wordplay in Latin texts or the symbolic nature of his resistance. But in Christian accounts, it was accepted as fact. His final words, "Turn me over," became a lasting sign of courage and irony under torture. Lawrence's execution did not break the church. Instead, it solidified his legacy. Within decades, he was being venerated as a martyr across the empire. Shrines were built at the place of his death and his burial. His name was preserved not only for his faith, but for how he responded when power demanded submission. Lawrence was no longer just enforcing ideas now. Those ideas were becoming systems of control. The death of Lawrence was not an isolated punishment. It was part of a systematic attempt by the Roman Empire to dismantle the Christian church from within. Under Emperor Valerian, a sequence of legal measures targeted every layer of Christian leadership, wealth, and influence. In the first edict issued in 257 AD, bishops, priests, and deacons were banned from conducting worship and ordered to perform sacrifices to Roman gods. When many refused, they were executed. A second edict in 258 extended penalties to members of the upper class, senators, equestrians, and matrons who identified as Christians. Punishments included property confiscation, exile, and execution. Christian cemeteries and places of worship were seized by the state. These edicts were enforced not by mobs or local governors alone, but by imperial agents acting under direct orders. Prefects like the one who condemned Lawrence were responsible for carrying out interrogations and documenting refusals to comply with Roman religious expectations. In this way, ideology became policy, and policy became enforcement. The process was bureaucratic. Christians who failed to sacrifice were labeled hostes publicinimes of the state. Confiscated goods were transferred to imperial treasuries. Trials were conducted quickly and punishment was swift, especially in Rome. Punishment varied depending on rank. Lower-class Christians might be forced into labor or left alone if they renounced their beliefs. Elite Christians, on the other hand, were more likely to be used as public examples. Their executions were performed in visible locations, city forums, military camps, and major roads. The goal was deterrence, not merely death. Lawrence's execution was unique in method, but consistent in purpose. His role as archdeacon and custodian of the church's wealth made him symbolically important. By choosing to defy imperial demands and instead elevate the poor, he transformed himself into a direct challenge to Roman hierarchy. His execution was not just a punishment, it was a political message. The result was fear. Many Christians went underground. Services were held in private homes or catacombs. Others fled to rural areas beyond Roman administrative reach. But the effect was not collapse, it was consolidation. In killing its most visible leaders, Rome unwittingly strengthened the church's internal unity. Martyrdom narratives began to circulate. Stories of Lawrence's death, along with others like it, were copied and read aloud. They were used not just to mourn, but to instruct. They demonstrated how to respond to power with discipline and how to die without surrender. Even individuals close to Lawrence were targeted by these systems. Lawrence's arrest and execution did not occur in isolation. The Roman strategy against Christianity under Emperor Valerian extended to everyone connected to the church's hierarchy. After Lawrence was put to death, those associated with him, other deacons, aides, and even lay supporters were scrutinized. and in many cases detained or executed. Among the 7 original deacons who served under Pope Sixtus II, most were killed within days of each other. Deacons Agapetus and Felicissimus, for example, were executed in the same sweep that killed Sixtus. Their roles were similar to Lawrence's, managing local alms and supporting the poor. Once Sixtus was gone, the Roman prefects moved quickly to eliminate any coordinated leadership. Suspicion also fell on wealthy Christian patrons who had previously donated to the church. Owning Christian texts or giving sanctuary to clergy was seen as an act of defiance. Several Roman matrons were arrested and interrogated. Landowners who allowed services to be held on their estates were fined or exiled. In effect, the Roman state began to treat association with Christian leaders as conspiracy. Inside the church, fear began to strain trust. Without clear leadership, coordination across districts faltered. Messages between communities were often intercepted. Some clergy went into hiding. Others questioned whether martyrdom was the only path left. Internal debates broke out about compliance, whether it was morally acceptable to sacrifice to the emperor publicly while remaining Christian in private. The persecution fractured bonds that had once been seen as sacred. Clergy could no longer trust every parishioner. Letters from bishops during this period record the growing sense of vulnerability, not just to violence, but to betrayal. The line between church and state had become dangerous to cross, and every connection to a martyr was now a liability. Lawrence's legacy became a rallying point, but also a warning. His closeness to Sixtus had sealed his fate. Those who had worked beside him faced surveillance and punishment. The very idea of Christian brotherhood, once a spiritual strength, was now a legal risk. Signs of strain in leadership and personal stability were now evident. Lawrence did not live long enough to experience a drawn-out personal decline, but the effects of his execution and those of his peers left clear marks on the surviving Christian community in Rome. As the persecution continued under Emperor Valerian, church leaders and members began to show signs of psychological collapse, social withdrawal, and physical deterioration under pressure. Surviving letters from bishops in Carthage and Alexandria report instances of mental exhaustion, hallucinations, and collapse among the clergy. Some priests refused to leave their quarters for weeks, afraid of being seen or followed. A few began performing sacraments in near silence, under constant fear of spies. The emotional toll of watching close colleagues captured, interrogated, and executed left many clergy fragmented in thought and action. In particular, those who had worked closely with Lawrence began to suffer both spiritual and physical consequences. Acolytes went missing. Others developed fevers or malnutrition from extended hiding. Many fasted excessively as acts of mourning or penitence. Some accounts describe clergy breaking under interrogation, not always due to torture, but to isolation, sensory deprivation, and fear of implicating others. Lawrence's execution by roasting became a mental image that haunted the underground church. Descriptions of his final moments were repeated and illustrated, sometimes with physical depictions carved onto walls in hidden chapels. Rather than just inspire reverence, these symbols could also provoke night terrors and paranoia. Martyrdom had become an expectation, not just a possibility, and this created a constant state of psychological pressure among those still alive. For the broader church, the collapse of central leadership in Rome meant that doctrinal disputes, authority struggles, and accusations of heresy began to resurface. Without clear communication channels or leadership succession, factions emerged. Accusations were made. One bishop in North Africa warned of brothers turning on brothers, not to preserve doctrine, but out of fear of imperial detection. Even those in hiding were not safe from illness or breakdown. In the damp catacombs outside Rome, some clergy lived for months without sunlight, relying on messengers for food and news. Respiratory disease was common. In one report, a deacon who had avoided capture eventually died from a lung infection brought on by prolonged underground living. There was no organized resistance, The church had no army, no formal state. Its power was moral, social, and symbolic. As those symbols were publicly destroyed through execution, confiscation, and suppression, the remaining leaders began to fray. Disorientation, physical decline, and loss of confidence marked the period that followed Lawrence's death. Despite worsening conditions, the memory of Lawrence's defiance remained central to Christian identity. Lawrence's execution was carried out publicly and deliberately. According to Christian tradition, he was brought before the Roman prefect 3 days after Pope Sixtus II's death. When asked again to surrender the church's treasures, he responded by presenting the poor, sick, and disabled, declaring them the true wealth of Christianity. This act was seen not only as defiance, but as public mockery of imperial authority. He was sentenced to death. The method chosen was not common. Roman executions typically used the sword, especially for Roman citizens or high-ranking individuals. But Lawrence, though a deacon, was condemned to be roasted alive on a metal gridiron. Iron bars were heated beneath him. He was placed on top, with chains holding him down. The execution took place near the Roman field of Verano, possibly in the presence of officials and local crowds. Reports of his final moments vary slightly, but the central detail remains consistent. As the heat consumed his body, Lawrence allegedly said, "This side is done, turn me over." The line was later repeated in sermons, martyrologies, and artworks. Some treated it as gallows humor, others as spiritual triumph. Regardless of tone, it was remembered as a sign of composure and resistance under extreme torture. There are no known last decrees or letters from Lawrence himself. He left no writings. His final legacy was a rala statement made while dying that would define how generations remembered him. Christian communities repeated his words as proof that Rome could not crush their identity or dignity. After death, Lawrence's body was buried in a cemetery along the Via Tiburtina. The location became a site of pilgrimage. Within a few decades, the Emperor Constantine would build a church over the spot, the Basilica of San Lorenzo fuori le Mura, still standing today. Lawrence left no heirs, no private estate, and no personal possessions. What he passed down was a single act of defiance, captured in a phrase and magnified by the method of his death. Lawrence died on August 10, 258 AD. Power was immediately contested. The execution of Lawrence was intended to send a message that the Roman state could suppress organized Christianity by eliminating its leaders and seizing its assets. But that strategy did not succeed. Within a year of Lawrence's death, the imperial plan began to fall apart. In 260 AD, Emperor Valerian was captured by Persian forces during a campaign in the East, an unprecedented humiliation for a Roman emperor. His son, Gallienus, assumed control of the Western Empire and quickly reversed his father's religious policies. The edicts of persecution were suspended, and the church was allowed to operate again in public. Property was returned, cemeteries were reopened, surviving bishops were reinstated. The abrupt change in imperial policy created confusion. Many Christians who had gone into hiding emerged to find former roles vacant or reorganized. Some had died in exile or under torture. Others had renounced the faith under pressure and now sought reconciliation. Internal church debates broke out over how to treat the lapsed. Lawrence's name became a dividing line. For those who had remained firm, he represented the ideal response to tyranny: faithful, unyielding, and uncompromising. For others, he became a symbol of the high cost of resistance, raising questions about how much sacrifice was truly required. The Roman prefect who ordered Lawrence's execution disappears from the record shortly after Gallienus's reforms. No trials or punishments are known to have occurred. The state moved on, but the church did not forget. The attempted dismantling of the church's leadership had failed. In fact, the martyrdoms created a new kind of institutional memoria, canon of figures whose deaths became central to Christian identity. Shrines to Lawrence were built in Rome, Ravenna, and beyond. His name entered the liturgy. His story was taught to new converts. What began as a political crackdown ended in a spiritual escalation. Rome's plan to eliminate resistance by force instead produced a legacy that outlasted the regime that had ordered it. The historical record of Lawrence began to evolve immediately. The traditional account of Lawrence's death roasted alive on a gridironus, one of the most iconic martyrdom stories in early Christianity. For centuries, it was accepted as fact. His final words were inscribed in manuscripts, repeated in homilies, and depicted in paintings and sculpture across Europe. The gridiron became his standard symbol in Christian art, but modern historians have challenged the accuracy of this account. Most point to the Acts of the Martyrs, a collection of hagiographies written decades or even centuries after the events they describe. These texts often mix eyewitness testimony with legend, theological symbolism, and oral tradition. In Lawrence's case, the story may have evolved over time for didactic purposes. Scholars have noted that Emperor Valerian's edicts specified beheading as the standard method of execution for clergy. It was swift, and in line with Roman legal procedure. The tale of roasting, some argue, could be the result of a translation error or deliberate embellishment intended to highlight Lawrence's endurance under extreme torture. Others suggest the imagery was allegorical. Early Christian writers frequently used fire as a symbol of trial and purification. The phrase "roasted on a gridiron" may have begun as metaphor and later been taken literally. Still, the detail of Lawrence's final joke, "turn me over," appears early in the written tradition, suggesting that some core element of the story may be authentic, even if the exact method is debated. Despite these doubts, Lawrence's impact is not in question. His actions before death, especially presenting the poor as the church's treasurer, attested in multiple sources and align with the responsibilities of the archdeacon role. Historians agree that he was arrested, executed, and buried with honor. His martyrdom became a cornerstone of Christian memory. The reinterpretation of Lawrence's death reveals more than historical uncertainty. It highlights the way narrative, belief, and institutional identity interact. Whether roasted or beheaded, Lawrence was remembered not for how he died, but for what he said and did when confronted by power. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Lawrence's story. The execution of Lawrence in 258 AD did not end a movement, it helped shape one. His death became part of a broader transformation in how the Christian Church understood power, resistance, and sacrifice. Unlike military leaders or emperors, Lawrence wielded no army and left behind no legal reforms. His legacy was built on an idea that the value of a community lies not in its wealth, but in its weakest members. That principle outlived the Roman edicts that sought to destroy it. Within 2 generations, Christianity was legalized. Within a century, it became the state religion of the empire that had once killed its leaders. Martyrs like Lawrence were not forgotten in this shift, they were formalized. Churches, feast days, and doctrines were built in their names. Their stories served as moral instruction and institutional foundation. The systems that once punished Christians were eventually absorbed and redirected. Imperial power did not disappear, it was baptized. Lawrence's story helped shape the Church's emerging identity as a moral counterweight to state authority, even as it later became part of that same structure. Today, Lawrence is remembered in both religious and civic spaces. He is the patron saint of the poor, cooks, librarians, and archivists. His feast day, August 10th, is observed worldwide. His basilica in Rome remains one of the city's oldest continuous places of worship. More than 1,700 years later, the questions his story raises have not disappeared. What do we owe to the powerless? What is the price of moral clarity? Can institutions remain true to the ideals of their martyrs once they inherit power? Lawrence offered no abstract theology, no written works, and no political platform. He left only a model how to confront a demand for obedience with a clear act of truth. Whether his death was by sword or fire, it changed what the Church remembered and what it became. Power can command obedience, but it cannot define worth. That is what Lawrence rejected and what he died to prove.